COVID shutdown. And
Mhm.
Janet just got me some information today that people will want to hear about. So I think it'll be kind of fun. We're experimenting.
Okay.
Experimenting.
Yes.
This whole year has been an experiment.
Well, there are many ways to view it. That wasn't one of the ones I would have used.
Yeah. Oh. This thing is charging or what? Oh, yeah.
Before the shutdown, I received a large donation of books from a former member of one of the other roundtables who had passed away. And we're still waiting till we can find a way to auction those. But starting next month, we're going to be experimenting with some ideas for how to do virtual auctioning. And that, in fact, it's a couple of minutes in, so let me go ahead and start explaining that. We were donated 3 fairly high-end limited edition prints of Civil War art. And one of them is a Don Troiani piece that's over 30 years old and long out of print in terms of new copies. So it's only been available on the secondary market for the last couple of decades. Janet was investigating options that a nonprofit could use for doing auctions of things other than something like eBay. And we believe she has found one that is appropriate and not costly in terms of the bite they take out of the final auction value. So we're going to be experimenting next month. Before next month's meeting and running till mid-December, we will be running a 4-week auction for these 3 pieces of art. And so the next month's announcements, the email and the call will have the information on how to bid because we want this to be for the people who attend our meetings rather than just going to somebody somewhere out on eBay. And we're going to use this as an experiment to see how a virtual auction will work for our group and whether it will succeed in raising money for battlefield and other preservation purposes. So watch your November announcements, both email and in print, and we'll have the information there. But I believe Janet set the bidding to start before our next meeting.
Okay.
So it'll be live and in progress at the time of the meeting. We'll be able to tell how it's going at the meeting itself. Other than that, things are mostly on hold, unfortunately. The Remembrance Day events at the drum barracks are, of course, not going to happen. The other things that normally come up in November, the Veterans Day and other events at cemeteries and memorials, the problem is that we're still not gathering because we would rather, you know, like survive. So everything is still virtual. But for those of you receiving the call, I've been putting in announcements of some of the other virtual events that are available online besides our own meetings. And I will be continuing to do that and rotate in some of the other announcements from different organizations that are doing something cool. But I'm glad that the Lincoln Shrine has started doing online events. That's something that I think needed to happen. So that was fortunate that they've started. But now I think it is time to announce our speaker and get going with tonight's meeting. As I mentioned, Janet is out of town. Michael may be still unpacking his office because I believe he moved his office just a few weeks ago and he was working on details of that the last time I talked to him. But Janet is away on a trip and was not sure she would be able to dial in for tonight's meeting because of limited Wi-Fi access. David Dixon has spoken to our group before. And for those of you who were at one of the meetings, the one in particular that I remember is the Lost Gettysburg Address. There's the third Gettysburg Address speech, the one that nobody ever talks about, was the subject of the meeting, and he did a book on that subject. This time, his talk is again related to a new book coming out from University of Tennessee Press, and I believe that we're going to be regaled about the sources of some of the political upheavals in Europe affecting the political upheavals in the United States, as he deals with one of the immigrants that we got from the German rebellions. And so I want to hand things over to tonight's speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome David Dixon.
Hey, thanks a lot, Nick. Thanks for having me. So David, I'm going to go down here and share my screen.
Yep, I just sent that over, so you should be able to do that.
You're way ahead of me. Okay.
And if everybody else could just keep their audio on mute so that we can hear David, and then David, what you want to do in regards to Q&A, that's up to you.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this. Now, can everyone see the first PowerPoint slide?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, super. All right, great. All right.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, super. All right, so so thanks so much for having me. And David, are you able to mute the other participants?
I am, and I will do that. Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, because I'm getting a lot of feedback. All right, great. Well, as Nick mentioned, and some of you are familiar with my work, I focus on biography, basically obscure characters with compelling stories. And today's subject, August Village, certainly fits that bill. But I think biography can do a lot more. It can function as an intimate window into aspects of the Civil War that go beyond the bullets and the battlefields. So today, what I'd like to do is challenge you to think differently about America's defining event. At 10 a.m. on April 7th, 1862, a brigade of Union soldiers from the Army of the Ohio rushed aboard the steamer John J. Roe at Savannah, Tennessee. They steamed upriver, floated across, and docked at a place called Pittsburgh Landing. As they disembarked, General Ulysses S. Grant ordered one regiment, the 32nd Indiana, to detach from their brigade and march immediately to the battlefield. As they began their march, the regiment's brass band struck up their favorite tune to get them excited for battle. The men sang at the top of their voices to this music. And if you can name this tune, please type it in the chat area. I'm going to play it on my phone, and here we go.
David, we're not hearing anything.
You're not hearing it, okay.
Now we hear it.
All right.
Where's the chat area?
It's in the little bubble.
We're not hearing it again. I'm not sure what happened with your audio, but it's not picking up. Not coming through. Barely heard that.
Okay. Well, you'll have to take my word for it. Anybody, can anybody, up? See, Janet and Nick both identified this.
Yeah, I must say.
That's right. Yeah. So that's the French national anthem, La Marseillaise. So why are U.S. soldiers marching into battle singing the French national anthem? Why not the battle cry of freedom or God Save the Union or any of the 9,000 patriotic songs that were published in the North during the Civil War? Perhaps even more confusing is the fact that this regiment, the 32nd Indiana, was composed entirely of German immigrants. Now, how did the Germans and the French feel about each other in the 19th century? Anyone remember Napoleon? The Franco-Prussian War? When we read the translation, the English translation of these lyrics, it becomes even more puzzling. The typical Union soldier was not fighting tyranny or fearing that foreign invaders were about to murder their wives and children. This stanza makes a little more sense at first glance, but wait a minute. This is early April 1862. The overwhelming majority of Union soldiers have little interest in freeing the slaves. They're fighting to preserve the federal union. And who are these kings that want to enslave them? No, to really understand why German Union soldiers are singing a French anthem, in French no less, and railing against the tyranny of kings and slavery, we need to change how we've traditionally viewed the American Civil War. This was not merely a sectional dispute within the family, Northern brother fighting Southern brother, over strictly American issues. We need to adopt a more expansive global view of the bloodiest conflict of the 19th century world. Now, a number of terrific historians have been studying the American Civil War through a global lens recently, and these are two of my personal favorites. I use the work of Don Doyle and Andre Flesch, among others, to provide context for my study of one particular German-American Civil War figure. So today I'd like to make three arguments. First, the American Civil War was part of a long-term radical revolution focused on democratic government, workers' rights, and human freedom. This revolution was international in scope and unprecedented in world history. Secondly, recent immigrants in general, and German immigrants in particular, played a decisive role in the ultimate success of the Union Army. And finally, radical 48er leaders like August Willich helped transform a war to preserve the Union into nothing less than social revolution, a revolution that was even more radical than the American Revolution of 1776. Now, when we talk about radicals and their revolutions in the 18th century, one thinker stands head and shoulders above his peers in terms of influence. Thomas Paine's classic Common Sense, published in 1776, sold more than 100,000 copies, the largest selling book proportional to population in American history. Paine inspired American founders to pursue independence rather than merely a redress of grievances against the English crown. He also claimed that this conflict was about human rights and social justice. Paine said, quote, "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. He went on to say that, quote, my country is the world and my religion is to do good. The American Revolution that Paine helped inspire was certainly radical from a political perspective. The violent overthrow of a hereditary monarch replaced by a democratic republic was transformational, but it stopped well short of the ideals of social justice and equality envisioned by Paine and promised in the Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution may have been a political earthquake, but it left social relations within the country mostly unchanged. The theme of a political revolution, conceived and executed by social elites like Washington, was reflected in the international leaders who supported the Patriot cause. These three foreign generals were aristocrats. They fought for political freedoms, not social re-engineering. So Thomas Paine ends up in France, and French radicals wasted little time in trying to emulate the success of their American allies. They initiated an ambitious, sweeping social revolution, but they overreached in adopting the most radical aims of Enlightenment philosophers. They believed that perfect equality was the natural order of things, and leaders must impose it on the populace whether they were ready for it or not. Romantic visions of this new social order devolved into a macabre nightmare. Now, the American Revolution had more limited aims. It had been carefully planned and was carried through with a conventional army. The French Revolution, in contrast, relied on an incohesive gangs of rioters. The result, of course, was chaos and terror. The French Revolution and the French Republic soon disintegrated as popular general Napoleon Bonaparte consolidated his power and became Emperor of France. Dreams of the French revolutionary leaders were abandoned for the time being. In the first half of the 19th century, witnessed the beginnings of a dramatic shift from a society of rural farmers and artisans to a workforce that was increasingly urban and factory-based. Instead of having control over one's own labor and production, capitalists now controlled most industries and workers were paid in wages. Periodic harvest failures and the reluctance of rulers to consider liberal reforms increased the pressure on kings and princes throughout Western Europe. An outgrowth of French revolutionary socialism that was called communism was gaining support among middle-class intellectuals. Tensions between liberal reformers and conservative elites finally came to a head in the watershed year 1848, where, as you might suspect, all the trouble started in Paris. On a windy gray February morning, thousands of unemployed Parisians gathered on the Place de Madeleine. They were soon joined by 700 students who crossed the Seine singing La Marseillaise. Before long, street fighting ensued. Barricades were erected. 2 days later, King Louis Philippe abdicated. Rebels took turns sitting on his throne. One scrawled this note: "The people of Paris to all Europe, liberty, equality, and fraternity." They took the chair to the Bastille and they burned it. And out of its ashes rose the Second French Republic. Now, despite the fact that there was no internet, no Twitter, news of the French revolt spread like wildfire. Revolts erupted all over Western Europe. After some initial success, they were all crushed by reactionary forces and absolute rule reinstated. France was the last to submit when Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew crowned himself emperor. Shortly before these uprisings, August von Willich renounced his nobility and resigned from the Prussian army. He became one of the key leaders of the revolutions in the German states. He fought in 3 rebellions in the southern Rhineland and in Baden before taking refuge in France, Switzerland, London, and finally in America. In the face of so many failed democratic revolts in their homelands, these political refugees sought a place where they could live out their principles of free, popular government and eventually return to Europe to reignite their revolutions. Now, the America where most of these dissidents landed was hardly the fulfillment of the French Revolution's promise of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. America was indeed a free society. It offered economic opportunity that was largely absent in Europe. But it was just as socially stratified as the old country. An aristocracy of wealth took the place of royal privilege. A large established base of American-born nativists resented this flood tide of European immigrants. A huge permanent underclass of black slaves were treated more like farm animals or worse. Once political refugees like Willich realized that hopes for further revolution in Europe had evaporated, most committed themselves to create a more perfect republic in America. Like many of his fellow 48ers, Willich edited a German language newspaper, the first daily labor paper in America in any language. In his opening editorial, he vowed to, quote, support those reforms that are supposed to make this republic a truth for everyone. Now, despite his tireless efforts to promote labor unions and trade associations, Willich also formed alliances with local black leaders. This caused him considerable trouble and even put his life in jeopardy when he led a multiracial torchlight procession to protest the execution of John Brown. He developed an original idea to transform the U.S. into a workers' republic. His proposal would replace the Congress with a national trade assembly, thereby eliminating political parties and moving the country closer to its founding ideals, a true social republic, as he called it. Now, it was at best a novel but naive concept, and at worst, a radical and dangerous idea in the eyes of many conservatives. Willich welcomed the coming of the Civil War, not to save the Union, but to create a social revolution that would defeat the slaveholding aristocracy, preserve democracy and Republican government, and secure the triumph of free labor. He hoped that this in turn would lead to better working conditions and ultimately to a revision of the relationship between labor and capital. In this new future, Willich dreamed that worker exploitation of all kinds would end and that wage slavery would be replaced by a more fair value for value exchange. Now, exiled radicals from all over the Western world supported the Union war effort. Russia, Cuba, and Spain were represented, along with 140,000 Irish immigrants who looked to Thomas More as their hero. Immigrants from Norway and other Scandinavian countries also had ethnic regiments, like the 15th Wisconsin of Villish's own brigade. Hungarians and Canadians fought for the Union. Prussian revolutionary Karl Schurz became the most accomplished German-American immigrant in U.S. history after fighting alongside Willich in Baden. If you look at the numbers, the impact of immigrants and blacks on the Union victory is indisputable. Together, they represented the majority of federal soldiers who served in the Civil War. Foreign-born soldiers, for example, accounted for 25% of the Union Army's manpower, despite the fact that they represented less than 13% of the male population. Immigrants from the German states, primarily from the Southwest, where the largest armed rebellions actually took place, numbered more than 200,000. Many joined regiments or companies that were either predominantly or exclusively German-speaking. They shared characteristics that made them unusually successful soldiers. They were, on average, 2 years older than their native-born counterparts. Many came from Turner societies. These were German social organizations that featured military drilling and rigorous physical fitness. A large number, especially in the officer ranks, had combat experience in Europe, something that their native-born counterparts almost always lacked. Their concentration in urban areas made them more resistant to disease. Most were either strongly anti-slavery or, like Willich, full-fledged abolitionists. They were highly motivated to finish what they had started in Europe. For Willich and other recent immigrants, 1861 was 1848 all over again. In his words, it involved, quote, the same rights of men against a combined conspiracy of a traitorous slave aristocracy with the same powers of the old world. Germans were also anxious to prove that they belonged as Americans in the midst of virulent and even violent anti-immigrant sentiment. Willich personally recruited 4 companies and served in the all-German 9th Ohio Infantry. But by the summer of 1861, he was awarded his own command. Here we see Willich with his Lieutenant Colonel Henry von Treebe, who fought against him in 1848, and Carl Schmidt, his aide in Germany and his adjutant in the 32nd. His men called Willich Papa, and he referred to them as my little children or my fellow citizens. For some time, Willich refused to hire a chaplain. When a cleric was forced on him, that reverend lasted just 6 weeks. Willich conducted graveside services himself, often ending by stressing that theirs was a conflict not over nationality, but a war that was in the interest of all humanity. Now, it's not my purpose here to deliver a blow-by-blow account of Willich's military accomplishments, either in Europe or in the American Civil War. There's 10 chapters and 8 maps in the book that do a pretty good job of that. But for a little flavor of just what kind of commander this man was, let's return just for a moment to the battlefield at Shiloh, where we last left Willich and his men singing the French revolutionary anthem, La Marseillaise. They arrived on Stacy Field, where Willich was supposed to be held in reserve. he immediately requested and was granted permission to pass to the front and make a bayonet charge. Before they moved, Village addressed his troops. Little children, today decides the fate of America. Then a shell burst overhead. If we are beaten today, everything is lost. Let us do our duty as a free man does. Village made 5 successive charges, changing front 9 times in the process. Despite this display of technical skill and discipline, his troops were rattled after they outran their support on both flanks. So Village halted them, rode around to the front of his column, and with his back to the enemy, drilled them in the manual of arms until they regained their composure. In the meantime, men were dropping in the ranks from enemy fire. He would repeat this incredible feat 18 months later at Chickamauga. Lew Wallace later described it as the most audacious act of bravery he had seen in the entire war. The New York Times penned an extraordinary tribute to the general, calling him, quote, undoubtedly the ablest and bravest officer of German descent engaged in the War of Rebellion. In an immediate sense, however, Village failed in 2 of the 3 great causes of his life. He and his fellow revolutionaries did not overthrow the monarchs and princes of the various German states, nor did they create a unified German Democratic Republic. Village's unceasing efforts to transform the American political system into a social republic where workers controlled the means of production and received full value for their labor never gained serious traction. His efforts to recruit and lead immigrant volunteers did help defeat the slave-holding aristocracy in the Confederate States, but the vision that Village and Lincoln shared of a more perfect Republican nation was a lofty goal that would probably take generations to realize. By 1865, it was the radicals who had won the American Civil War. The precious but fragile republic that Washington had founded had not been defeated. That outcome would have delighted the princes of Europe. Rather, popular government proved viable and resilient. It would take many years, but eventually most of Europe would finally follow America's example and either abolish the monarchy or make it purely ceremonial. The largest slaveholding empire in the world vanished overnight, and with it, about $3.5 billion in wealth. This was more than the combined value of all U.S. manufacturing and railroads combined. That's $105 billion in today's dollars. So talk about radical economic change. Equally significant is the idea that America would have to transition to a free labor economy overnight. Although many radicals foresaw improved conditions for workers, it didn't work out that way, as the Civil War stalled the labor movement. It took decades for unions to regain their pre-war momentum. But the most radical outcome of the Civil War was the transformation of chattel slaves into American citizens. This held the most promise for epic change. For a time, the entire racial hierarchy in the southern states was turned upside down, with black men serving in Congress, while many southern white elites were stripped of the franchise. Radical Reconstruction, however, ended in conservative reaction, and we are still trying to erase the legacy of slavery and its successor, Jim Crow, 150 years later. Historian Eric Foner argues that the enduring challenges for radicals is that they must be, quote, willing to fight and lose for a long time before even achieving partial success. Military men like Willich came from the well-educated German middle class. They grew to resent aristocratic dominance. They also resented the forces of rapid industrialization that robbed working people of their independence and their dignity, and they threatened to consign them to a permanent underclass. Their commitment to change and their frustration with intractable rulers pushed them into radicalism and rebellion. The reddest of the red, as Willich was known by friend and foe alike, clung stubbornly to radical prescriptions and violent means, even after such measures had failed. Rather than give up on his cherished democratic socialist principles, Willich and other rebel leaders emigrated from Germany in the hope that they would find a warmer reception for their ideas across the ocean. Now, the export of German revolutionists and their ideology to America made sense. After all, radicals throughout Europe had been working in concert for a Republican vision that, at least in theory, transcended national borders. The multicultural United States of America seemed an ideal place to continue that struggle. So Willich changed course from system overthrow to extensive reform through existing legislative channels. He positioned German American sacrifice in the Civil War as an international human rights crusade during frequent speeches to his troops. The general advised Union veterans to remain vigilant in the wake of victory, and he urged them to support democratic revolutions in the Old World. No temporary peace will undo the revelations of the times, he said. Soon the voice of the people will be heard, claiming the rights of men. Willich urged his listeners to wave the American banner of human liberty above the storm as a pilot light for the struggling nations. Pioneering German sociologist Max Weber wrote, "What is possible would have never been achieved if in this world people had not reached for the impossible." 19th century proposals like an 8-hour workday, unemployment benefits, child labor laws, once maligned as radical assaults on American institutions, became mainstream public policy in the 20th century. Activists like Willich, who promote far-reaching reform, may be forced to wait decades or even centuries for favorable moments and conditions to emerge. Moreover, most extreme ideas never come to fruition. Circumstance and environment forced Willich to change his tactics at times, but his core principles never changed. Indeed, they formed a prism through which he viewed everything, including the American Civil War. Here's what he said to a fellow German-American officer in 1862. "Encouraging and promoting a solution to the social question is and will remain the only task of my life. This work alone not only makes life more challenging for me, but in my view, gives it value." So what larger lessons can we learn from the radical nature of the American Civil War? Revolutionary social, political, and economic change usually happens incrementally over long periods of time. But radical actors often provide that emotional spark that, given the right timing and circumstances, can create a tipping point event. John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry is a good example. Brown's extreme acts made it easier for radical secessionists to convince many of their fellow Southerners that Lincoln's election was just yet another existential threat. The failed European democratic revolutions of 1848 provided rationales for American radicals on both sides of the secession crisis. As I've argued, these radical 48er revolutionaries were a key part of Lincoln's core constituency and one of many reasons why he was able to transform a war to save the constitutional union into a moral crusade for universal human rights and free labor. On the other hand, the idea that the people should be able to determine their own government, in other words, popular sovereignty, as opposed to the divine right of monarchs, was used by Southern radicals to justify their breakaway slaveholding republic. I believe that this helps explain why at critical moments in history, such as the American Civil War, radicals from opposing sides of a crisis are able to exert influence and accelerate events even if the majority of the population holds moderate or even conservative views. The sectional crisis in the United States was just one example of a pattern that keeps repeating when issues of global importance reach their tipping points. In the 18th and 19th centuries, political crises took center stage with the American and French revolutions, the revolts of 1848, and the American Civil War. All laid the groundwork for the eventual crumbling of monarchy in the Western world and the emergence of the modern nation state. In the 20th century, ethnic nationalism and economic crises brought other radicals to the fore. Communists like Lenin, Stalin, and Mao co-opted and perverted the theories of philosophers like Karl Marx and created repressive, authoritarian regimes that were in many ways the antithesis of Marx's original ideas. Radical fascists like Hitler converted ethnic pride into a murderous ethnic cleansing. Radical presidents like FDR used the Great Depression as a rationale for his ambitious New Deal legislation, which included dozens of initiatives decried as socialist by his rivals. By the end of the 20th century, we had Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicare, and huge public utilities that are all now bedrocks of a social safety net that would have been unthinkable to most mainstream Americans of the 19th century. Here in the 21st century, crises like pollution, terrorism, climate change, world hunger, and substance abuse top the list of global concerns. Radicals on all sides of these important issues are jockeying for position as their ability to communicate with the masses has been amplified by technology. At some unknown point in the future, these pressing and universal issues, like those that created the American Civil War, will reach a tipping point. And when they do, expect that radicals will emerge from the fringes of society and become well-known names throughout the world. We can only hope that they've studied history and understand that they have a responsibility to act in the interest of all humankind to create positive and lasting change. So here is the commercial for the book. It's $35 with free shipping, or if you want to order it on Amazon, it's $45, but I think it's better to order it from me. You can hit the PayPal button on my website. You can email me. You can mail me a check. Any of those options work. And I'd be happy to answer questions however Nick wants to do it, whether we want to do it on the chat line or we can do it live if it's not too crazy. So let's do that.
If people will stay muted unless they're asking a question, we can do it live.
Okay, that'd be great.
Dave, this is Michael Odonino.
Hello, Michael.
How are you doing? Thank you again for a great presentation. And
thanks.
The question I have is, are there any other of the 48 radicals that you felt played a equally significant role as did the subject of your new book?
Oh, certainly.
In the Civil War, I'm talking about. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And,
certainly. I mean,
who would they be?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, I would say Franz Sigel, and not particularly for his military acumen, but Sigel was an icon. He was a revolutionary icon. See, you have to understand that all these political refugees are coming to America after the failed revolutions of 1848 and 1849, and their dream is to someday go back and reignite these rebellions in Europe. And so Sigel Sigel and Willich, when they were together in New York, were very much on that page, planning on someday sending people back. But once a lot of these immigrants got to America and started finding that they had more economic opportunity, a lot of that enthusiasm kind of waned. But Sigel was certainly really important in inspiring a lot of German Americans, those 214,000 that I mentioned, to volunteer for the Union. So he was really important, maybe not in a military sense, but certainly in a recruitment sense. I would say Carl Schurz also. Carl Schurz bragged that Lincoln called him his most most enthusiastic campaign worker. So Carl Schurz again was very influential in the Midwest in influencing more conservative Germans to jump on the bandwagon and join the Union. And you'll notice that the Germans joined the Union in general, joined the Union effort much earlier than a lot of the Irish did. A lot of the Irish were Democrats, and the Democratic Party in many cases was not 100% behind the Union war effort. So I would say those two, but you could go on and on. I mean, Peter Osterhaus was also a native German, an excellent major general in the Western Theater. I think there were probably more good German officers in the Western Theater than perhaps in the Eastern Theater, although there were more Germans in general in the Eastern. But yeah, so if that answers your question.
Yeah, how about non-German 48ers that played a significant role in the U.S. Civil War?
Oh, sure. Well, Thomas Marr, Thomas Marr of the Irish Brigade comes to mind immediately. Again, as a revolutionary icon. If you read his recent biography, it's an incredible story. So by the time he gets to America, I mean, he's already like Willich, like Sigel, he's already world famous by this time. So yeah, I mean, you could go on and on from in the middle of the presentation. I noted Turchin from Russia, and I mean, you just go on and on and on. There are many more. Like I said, 25% of the Union Army were people that were born in Europe. Not to mention, their children that also served. So
Thank you very much. I really appreciate those insights.
sure. Tom Barron writes, Karl Marx wrote about the impending war. Does Village appear in his writings? Yeah, I didn't talk about this much, but yeah, this is a significant part of my book in the middle of the book. So Marx and Village, along with Mazzini and Garibaldi, many of these European immigrants, these political refugees, end up in London in the early 1850s, and Karl Marx is a very little known. There's no such thing as a Marxist at this time. He's not very well known. He's a brilliant philosopher, but certainly not well known. And he and Village compete for leadership of the Communist League in the worker societies in London, the emigrant worker societies. So much so they have such a rivalry that it almost comes to blows. Karl Marx insults Village by calling him an uneducated 4 times cuckolded jackass. And Village is about to challenge him to a duel when one of Marx's young acolytes steps forward and challenges Village, because Karl Marx certainly would not have accepted the challenge. So they have a duel. Village shoots this fellow in the head. Luckily, he survives. But this was the level of division within the radical camps among the European emigre community in London. Marx was much more conservative than Village. Village wanted to go back again and again, and even if he had to die in the process, and eliminate the princes of Europe. Karl Marx by this time had decided that he was more of an economic determinist, and he had decided that it would take a long time and that the economy would have to go through various stages of development before they were ready for that kind of revolution and that kind of social structure. So thanks for that question, Tom. Janet asks, what happened to Village after the war? Yeah, this is an interesting question because this man, he was a very talented military man, and frankly, he was not very talented at much else. He had a brief stint in politics, which ended in scandal, and not that he did anything illegal, but he was just absent in this job, and this job was a boondoggle. It was an auditor job for Hamilton County, Ohio. So that ended badly. And like I said, this was a man who was very well educated from a military perspective, and just a wonderful commander on the field, but a terrible politician. And he was an ideologue. So he was married to his political beliefs, and didn't believe in compromise, didn't believe in political engagement. He believed in violent revolution, and that's one of the reasons he was so successful in the Civil War. Let's see. So Tom Barron also asked another question. He says he was also slow paid by Horace Greeley for his articles. Yeah. So Karl Marx did write for Greeley's New York Tribune, and yeah, he wasn't paid very well. And as many of you might know, Marx actually wrote a letter to Lincoln near the end of the Civil War. Lincoln never replied, but certainly Marx and Engels followed developments of the U.S. Civil War very closely for the reasons that I talked about. This was not just an American conflict. This was an epic event of global importance. Roy Atherton asks, given the nature of European radicalism prior to 1861, were there any who may have participated with the Confederate States? There were a few, not too many Germans. In fact, I'm sure there is one, but I can't think of a single German of any stature, but I'm sure somebody would correct me. On the Irish side, for example, yes, I mean, there certainly were a few rather close associates, for example, of Thomas More. Their names don't come to mind immediately, but there were a couple of close associates of Thomas More that actually did serve in the Confederate cause. So, and as I mentioned before, you had rationales. You could make a rationale based on those 1848 revolutions on both sides of the question, right? Like Villish, you could argue that that you ought to support the Union because you want free democratic government. You want to end slavery, for example. It was very much a crusade against slavery among most of these German leaders. But on the flip side, you could also argue, as some of these Irish revolutionaries argued, that that they deserve the right to their own country. Ireland deserved to be their own republic. So, you know, why shouldn't the South deserve, you know, self-determination politically? So yes, there were radicals, European radicals on the Confederate States, but not in tremendous numbers. If anyone has a verbal question, happy to answer those too.
David,
Dan Honeywell had.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I give you a pair of radicals,
Yes.
a general on the north and a colonel on the south, and they're
Okay.
brothers
Yes.
from Alsace-Lorraine.
Oh, terrific. Who are they?
George Crawford Boyer is
Yes.
the northern,
Yes.
is Brigadier General of Militia.
Yeah.
His son was head of the military academy later. And
Yes.
Colonel Napoleon Bonaparte Boyer is on the south.
Yes. Yeah,
They're
terrific.
brothers.
Thank you
They're
for
brothers.
that, Ann. Yeah, thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
for that.
Dave, I noticed something in my own research that the Germans who immigrated here after 48 seem to be more heavily middle class than from the other countries. Was there a reason for that you know?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate assessment. You know, the many of the radicals that participated in this 1848, 1849 revolution were middle class, and many of them were artisans, right? So they were jewelers, they were shoemakers, they were tailors, for example. And so if you think about what happened when the Industrial Revolution came along, these folks were used to running their own shops and controlling, controlling their own home economy, if you will, as professionals, right? As artisans. And so when a lot of this trade, these trade occupations started moving more and more to factories, that was one of the things that radicalized these middle class folks. So one of the reasons that, in my view, that the 1848, 1849 revolutions failed, to your point, was that the revolutionaries really failed to motivate the peasant class, or the lower classes. The lower classes, for whatever reason, were just not were not as motivated as the say the middle class artisans were to rebel. They were very wary. They were used to being told what to do, let's say, and they didn't enlist in droves. And as you mentioned, the Germans in particular coming across. And then let's also remember that at this time, Germany in the mid 1800s is the most literate nation. It wasn't a nation. The most literate region or ethnic group in Europe, more so than France. I mean, the literacy rate was something approaching 80%. In Russia, for example, it was 7%. So these were highly educated, as you mentioned, often middle-class people. And so they were very, very different, for example, than many of the Irish immigrants that came over, who most of whom were not highly educated and were often struggling tenant farmers. So you're correct, Nick. I mean, the profile of the German immigrant at that time was a little bit different. I love all these questions. As soon as I say that, there won't be any more questions, right?
Yes, you jinxed it.
Oh no.
David.
David, when will the book be available for shipment?
Yeah, the book's available now. So it was supposed to come out September 1st. It came out a little bit early. So yeah, I've got a stack of them right here in my house, and I'm ready to send them out. So it is pretty amazing that I try to publicize this $35 in free shipping, and then my friends buy it for $45 on Amazon, and I messaged them back. I said, "What do you do? Why?" Well, Amazon is just so easy. So whatever. So feel free to buy it on Amazon if you want, but yeah, you can send me a check or send me an email or
if they buy it from you, will you sign it, Dave?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And if you want to send it to someone as a gift, given that the holidays are coming up, happy to do that too. I'll send it to anyone. I'll type up a little gift letter, whatever you want me to do.
Okay, I'll send you an order tomorrow for 2 books, and I like your signature. I loved your first book, and I'm sure I'll like this. Congratulations.
Well, I appreciate that, Dan. Thank you so much.
All right.
David,
This is Michael Odonino again. I don't know if we're out of questions. Maybe Janet, are you online? Is your Wi-Fi working to give us an announcement about the amazing auction that you've set up?
Nick was kind enough to do that for me at the beginning of the meeting, so I appreciate it.
Okay, perfect.
David, I did have a question for you.
Sure, Dave.
You're talking about mostly it sounds like the union was being supported by the foreigners, a little bit with the Confederates on there. Do you have any idea why that there seemed to be stronger support, like in England, to be able to support the Confederacy, supporting the building of their ships, supporting buying of the materials and cotton from the South? Any idea why that seemed to go against what everybody else was doing?
Well, I mean, I think you hit it on the head, right? I mean, that's England was the most industrialized country in Europe at that time. I mean, they started with their factories much earlier. And so while all of those major countries like France and, for example, also had an interest in cotton by this time, England was far and away the largest producer of cotton. So, I mean, you said it. They had a tremendous economic incentive, but of course, on the flip side, England had abolished slavery in the 18th century. So there was an equally large number of English citizens who were very much abolitionist and very much against slavery. So none of the European powers really wanted to throw their lot in with the Confederacy unless they thought the Confederacy could win. And I don't think any of them were ever convinced that the Confederacy was going to prevail. Although there were times where it looked like that might happen, they never threw their lot in with the Confederacy. But yeah, I mean, there were certainly a lot of Confederate sympathizers in England. I mean, my first book, I talk about Charles Anderson making a kind of a solo mission over to England with the express purpose of trying to make speeches and get in the newspaper to make sure that England did not recognize the Confederacy. So Roy asks, he says, I recently started reading a book regarding anti-Semitism, and it started as a possible significant issue in 1848 in Prussia, Upper Austria, and France. It also appeared to be a struggle of identity between well-off Jewish moneylenders to the monarchical governments of the Habsburg and Prussia, as well as the French Republic. Did any of these Jewish middle-class members also emigrate during the Civil War to join the Union forces? Boy, I wish I could answer that question, and I really haven't looked into the religious background of these emigres. But it's a very interesting question. I can tell you from Willisch's early life in Prussia that he and especially the elite circle in Berlin, he was actually, his foster father was actually a very well-known philosopher in Berlin, and they, in their social circle, there were many Jewish people in Jewish salons, intellectual salons in Berlin. So, I didn't see a lot of evidence of that myself, but of course I haven't really studied it like the people that you referenced. So I really can't comment on that. Oh, and then the book is The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. Okay. Well, that interests me because there is a connection between the Arendt family and Willich, a rather close connection with Willisch's foster mother was a member of Hannah Arendt's intellectual salon. So that is very interesting to me, and I am definitely going to pick up that book. So thank you so much for that, Roy, because there is a very good connection between the Arendts and Willisch's foster family. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
How did I?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
David, I was just going to say it's a very, very deep, thought-provoking analysis by Arendt on the well-to-do moneylenders, the people who made loans, basically the Jewish people who had connections with the royalty as well as the French. And they had little or nothing to do with middle-class, lower-class Jews, and depending upon what area they were from. But I know that the whole movement towards anti-Semitism really started with the French and the Austrians, curiously enough, according to her. And it developed naturally through the right-wing Nazism that came out of Austria, as well as what eventually became the unified German, I don't know, you can call it Confederacy, the German nature that Bismarck put together. But it developed quite a bit until it kind of, they enjoyed relatively great economic times up until World War I. And of course, World War I put an end to a lot of things, particularly the monarchies, with the exception of the Brits. But it's a very good book. I would definitely recommend it to anybody if they have the time to read it. As you can see, it's a rather large, thick book.
Hey, well, we've got all the time in the world now, Roy. So we might as well.
Oh, I'm retired. That's right.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Sure.
John Hyde asks, how did you happen to write this book? It's interesting because when I finished the Anderson book, I had a couple other projects, but they weren't really at a point where I could write a book. So I actually went out to my friends in the Civil War community, and many people that like Eric Wittenberg and Dave Powell, and some friends that I had made along the way with the first book, and I asked them to help me compile a list. I compiled a list of about 12 people that I thought were rather obscure characters like Willich, but they had really interesting lives, and they were connected to really important events. And so then I did an informal poll of various other peoples like yourselves, you know, who are really into the Civil War. And Villish's name actually came up more than anybody else. So I thought, okay, I'll take a look at that. And once I looked into his life, I was absolutely hooked. I mean, it's an incredible life story. It was a very, very difficult book to research and write because I don't speak German, I don't read German. And so I was very fortunate at Gettysburg to meet a German couple who comes, they're Civil War enthusiasts. They come to Germany every year. She happens to be a librarian. She offered to be my volunteer translator and did incredible work for me. And then I also, through some of my other contacts, stumbled upon a gentleman, a young gentleman, who is doing his PhD dissertation in Germany on Willich and the history of ideas. He and I traveled through Germany, France, Switzerland together, and then he came over to America. I took him to the battlefields, and so his dissertation will be published, I'm hoping, early next year, and then turn it into a German language biography with a little bit different focus than mine. But if it hadn't been for those two individuals, I probably would have abandoned the project, because anyone who's tried to read either the German handwriting from the mid-19th century, or even the Fraktur typeface, probably knows what I'm talking about. It's very, very difficult even to recognize the letters, much less translate them. So thanks for that question, John.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I've got a question about, you mentioned slavery was abolished in England. And so there was an anti-slavery ilk of the people that went over to fight in the Civil War in the U.S. The abolishment of slavery, how did that factor into when the Commonwealth started as opposed to the monarchy in England? And was there slavery during the monarchy and then it ended because of the Commonwealth, or vice versa? And the second question is, was there any slavery in Europe still at that time, besides England?
Great question. So I can't really speak intelligently to the political dynamics around Commonwealth versus monarchy and how that played into the abolishment of slavery in England. I'm really not qualified to speak on that. On the second question, though, as far as slavery in Europe, of course, you know, France had abolished slavery, and well, let's say that the Haitians probably the people in the Haitians in the Caribbean probably helped them abolish slavery when they revolted, but there were still serfdom of a certain type, right? In Russia, for example, serfdom had disappeared mostly. And when you talk about slavery, you have to kind of think broader than just you know, chattel slavery as it existed in America. There were all types of different servile institutions that could be called slavery in one way or another. So, but no, I mean, I'm trying to think of a Western. I don't think there was any slavery in Western Europe at this time, but there may still have been. I'm not sure about any Dutch colonies, but I'm not sure about the colonies. But
Dave,
there's certainly, yes.
Brazil was the only nation in the Western Hemisphere. There may have been remnants of quasi-legal, like indentured servitude in some of the colonies, the Dutch colonies. But
Right.
Brazil was the only other nation with chattel slavery. Western Hemisphere, Russian serfdom was the only real remnant of any form of it in Europe by that point. The rest of European nations had abolished it officially.
Nice. Yeah.
It's kind of like the last vestiges of medieval behavior was dying out, which had the serfdom. But I had 4 relatives in my dad's lineage who were bonded although Michael and I have had discussion about that issue, bonded for a period of limited period of years because they stole something, and a magistrate in England shipped them off.
Yes.
One of them ended up in Virginia Plantation, another one ended up down in Georgia, and a couple of them down in the Caribbean somewhere. But that sort of thing kind of petered out by the time we got to the Civil War.
Yeah, Roy, it's funny you mentioned that because you know, I've done my family history and I'm familiar with my wife's family history. So the kind of the standing joke is all of my relatives were kind of like, oh, my ancestors were kind of like yours, Roy. I mean, they all came over as criminals or ne'er-do-wells, and we found one ancestor of mine that was put in jail by my wife's ancestor in Connecticut in the 1600s, and that pretty much tells the story there. So,
Yeah.
so thank you for that.
Yeah, the English, King George, to him, it was a way of alleviating the crime that was prevalent in England, and particularly among those who really didn't live there from the time they were born. Irish especially got yanked out and shipped off. They were notorious for doing that during that period of time. And I'm talking about the late 1600s, by the way.
Yes.
We're not even into the American Civil War as yet.
Right.
But,
well, by that time, they're sending them to Australia, right? So.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? This is really great. I'm glad there's been so many questions. This is terrific. Thank you. Hey, here's one from James. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Why don't you go ahead? Who's ever on the phone verbally, and then I'll answer James' question here.
Yeah. Okay. What year did you say slavery ended in England? You mentioned that about a half an hour ago.
I don't remember the exact date. It was late 1700s. 1780 something. 1790.
It might have been around the time of the French Revolution of 1787.
Yeah,
thereabouts.
Around that time. I don't know. Somebody will go on their phone and look it up, I'm sure.
Okay, so were the slaves that were already in the southern part of the United States, were some of them a lot of them sent over from England before they ended slavery? Is that how they ended up the slaves?
A lot of them are coming from the Caribbean, right? So there's this triangle trade going on. So a lot of the slaves are in the Caribbean, and that's why
if I could say this, David, I know that the Spanish were still very much involved in that during the time they still owned the southern part of the United States. I'm thinking of, well, the French had Louisiana, but the Spanish was still involved in that to some extent. And they, just like you said, they were getting them directly from the west coast of Africa, the Gold Coast, and they were getting them from Africans who are going out there and enslaving these people, chaining them up and bringing them up to the coast, and they would be brought over to the United States through the Caribbeans.
Dave, Mike Levino here. The slavery petered out in England, and by 1800, then the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 ended it in most of the empire, with a few exceptions that with the East India Company and the others, but ultimately by 1843 it had been completely abolished.
Right.
In all of the British Empire.
And of course, the transatlantic slave trade was supposed to be over in the early 1800s in America, but of course they found all kinds of ways around that. So, so James is asking, did the European soldiers in the American Civil War have any expectation of reciprocity with Americans coming to their aid in countries' wars? That's an interesting question. Were the European soldiers paid on par? Yes, they were paid on par with the American military. But as far as coming to aid, it's interesting because in the Germans, for example, So after the Civil War, of course, not long after the Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out, and just coincidentally, Vilich is over. He's made a trip because by now, even though he was sentenced to death, if he would have stepped back into Prussia, by 1870, they've passed some acts that are allowing the former revolutionaries to come back. So Vilich goes back to Germany to try to repair his relationship with his brother, and Prussia in particular, and the Franco-Prussian War breaks out. Well, he's 60 years old at this time. He volunteers. He goes to the prince, who is now the king of Prussia, even though he had fought against him on the battlefield, and says, "Hey, I believe in German unity. I want to sign up." And of course, the German king, the German commander says, "No way." But then there was a big controversy that breaks out, and this is one of the reasons why Carl Schurz decides to oppose the Grant administration and form this liberal Republican Party in 1872. Is that they later found out that Americans were shipping arms to the French in their fight with the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War. This created a huge controversy within the German-American community, and like I said, many of the German Americans decided to oppose Grant for that reason, and for many other reasons. But so as far as a feeling, I don't know, a feeling of reciprocity, I don't think it was so much reciprocity as the immigrants like Vilich, who had become an American citizen, are still looking for that window of opportunity. They're still looking for the opportunity to go back to Europe at some point and fight for their freedom. Certainly the Irish were, of course. So I mean, I think that was always in their mind, but I don't think there was never any promise of that from anyone that I'm aware of in the American administrations.
You know, Dave, one thing I'm looking into right now is my dad's grandfather was born and raised in Alsace-Lorraine, and he left because of that war in 1871. And I often wonder, you know, with the you mentioned, this is the first time I've heard of this, and it's probably something I have to look into, but arms shipments to the French. And I always have to wonder who's getting paid or who's receiving funds for that, you know?
Yeah. Some things never change. Yeah.
No, they never do.
All right. Anybody else? Yeah, I know we're all seniors, so we're
yeah, Dave. Dave, I want to.
Go ahead.
I want to commend you on the staging of your speech, because the ceiling light behind your head gives you an absolute glow of deity. You have a halo that is around your head, and I have no idea that you were such a cinematographer that you would present this. And so we have St. David Dixon presents the talk, and I congratulate you on that. I know you probably didn't really plan that, but it really did work out nice, and it gave you an air of authority, and I enjoyed your talk immensely.
Well, thanks, Dan. I mean, true confession is I have a pretty bad back, so I've converted my desk to a standing desk, so it does give a rather unusual aspect when you're looking at one of these. But yeah, I'm gonna try to do. I tried turning off before you came on. I tried turning off the light, but it was just a little too dark.
No, I think it just gives you a sense of authority and piety.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Dan.
Yeah, Dave, I have one last question.
Sure.
You mentioned that the radicalism of Europeans and how that's developed in this country seems to repeat itself. And I am just curious, do you have any thoughts about today's contemporary times and the radicalism that we've got going on? As it relates to what we went through in the first war 150 some years ago.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my wife has cautioned me, I mean, not to get involved in contemporary politics when I give these talks, but you know, it's hard not to. And certainly at the end of my talk, of course, I bring it back to today's times, and you can definitely draw, I mean, you can definitely draw parallels. And I guess the parallel that I would draw with today's time now and say the times during the Civil War is I personally am not so concerned with civil war or revolution, but what you do see is much of public opinion pulling away from the center and going towards these two extremes. Now I think the fringe extreme left and the fringe extreme right are still, in my opinion, relatively small elements, as they were in the before the Civil War, right? So you think about even if, for example, the fringe left in the Civil War, even if you take all of the religious fundamentalist abolitionists, and then you take these international human rights abolitionists like Vilish, for example, those groups are not necessarily working together, but even if you put them together, they're not anywhere close to being a consensus, even on the left, right? And similarly on the right. I mean, if you look at the Civil War, and you consider and I've done quite a bit of work on unionists, Southern unionists. If you consider the public opinion at the time in the South and the Southern states that became the Confederate states, in many of the states, particularly in Georgia that I spent a lot of time studying, if they had taken a fair vote, a popular vote on secession in Georgia, it probably would not have passed. So,
that's right.
So again, you have a relatively small group of radicals on the left and a small group of radicals on the right that are getting a lot of headlines, and they're creating a lot of angst, I think, in our country. So then, as I argued, if you do have some type of tipping point, and perhaps the only tipping point I can think of right now is all of this controversy around the fairness of the election. If somehow something happened that was just so egregious on either side that could be proven as a fact, then perhaps some of those radicals on those two sides might be able to exert enough influence to create some type of a violent event. But I'm just not. I have more faith in our republic than
I do
think.
too. I don't think we've reached that point where somebody comes into the Senate chambers with a cane and starts beating somebody over the head with it, as happened in 1860. But you know, I don't think we've gotten there. I don't think we're going to get there. I think common sense will certainly rule the day. And perhaps somebody ought to pick up the book by Thomas Paine and start reading that again. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's very important. It's important that we sit back and just give a breather to what's going on and think about what's going on.
Yeah, and I mean, if you read history as much as we all do, I mean, you see a lot of times and you read the newspapers and they think, oh my God, the sky is falling. You know, the republic is in danger of collapsing. And it usually doesn't get to that. So, yeah.
David, this is Michael Odanino. I want to thank you very much for the time and effort you took to share your incredible insights with us. I think we all benefited dramatically from the presentation you gave, and look forward to reading your book, and hope everyone orders it directly from you. and we'll look forward to seeing everyone. We're going to have another presentation next month, and as Janet has already mentioned, Nick has mentioned an upcoming auction. Try to overcome the fact that COVID limits our in-person meetings. But thank you so much, David. It was really a tremendous addition to our group, and we appreciate you immensely.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thanks for all the questions. I appreciate it.
All right. Everyone have a great evening.
Yep, thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye now.